So
And not
there's
only
a
that,
there's a
but
there's a side of the business model, right? You could have never predicted, right? Like that's a fatal
could
flaw in
have
that
never,
business model, right?
could have never. The other
Yeah.
side of it too is the telephone company ends up becoming our biggest competitor. And so as we're rolling this thing out, they're deciding on the back end, holy crap, all this money is being made on our lines. We should get into this business. And they started slow rolling things. And so that would slow all of our capital. And there's all kinds of fun horror stories in that one. But if
Right.
you want, I
So
can skip right
the
go
right
ahead.
timing. You have the right timing. Like you're in the right place at the right time with some potentially worthwhile partners. But like we talked about, the hardware becomes deprecated almost over the minute you deploy it. And then you've got AT&T essentially at the time and their equivalents all over the nation trying to
Brent, yep.
stop you.
So guess
And
what happens? So here's what happens, right? We roll it out and we're charging $19.95 and that gave you 20 hours. And this is during a time where long distance, whether it be cellular or landlines, you paid per minute, right?
Mhm.
Everything, it was pretty expensive. Long distance back then, you could spend over $1 a minute on a phone call. And at that time, AOL, even when you called in, it wasn't unlimited. It was so much for so many hours and you paid after that. So right after we do that, we roll it out. Sprint and AT&T announced they're going to play in this game and they're going to be $19.95 unlimited. Well, unlimited for us, based on the math, it cost us $50 to deliver. So all of a sudden, we have 600 franchisees nationwide, and we're all charging $20 a month, and so much a minute after that. And AT&T and Sprint, and then right after that, AOL basically flipped the switch, and then a company called Earthlink starts to pop their heads up, and all these national providers, and they're all $20, and they're backed by PE. They're backed by much bigger money than us, basically like Amazon, right? They've been on this path for 20 years where basically Wall Street's paying for every package that goes out the store. Well, I couldn't compete with it at that level. And so that became our death mark. And we tried to reinvent ourselves at that point. But the problem is this is where I learned the type of franchisee matters, right? So we sold to basically toll booth operators. I mean, at that time, if you put an ad in the newspaper or dial up internet, I mean, the phone was ringing off the hook because there just wasn't a lot out there. We were the first ones on the block. Well, when we told the franchisees, look, we're getting killed, bigger money has been attracted to this pie and they're buying their way into the industry. So we need to start selling websites. Well, I mean, the world is just getting connected to the internet. Google doesn't exist yet. The beginnings of search engines, you had to go there and register your business in there, right? They weren't spidering the internet. Content had to be pointed to them. And so we told these guys they needed to start selling business websites. Well, that was a hard sell back then. I mean, it's a no-brainer today, but back then people didn't even know what it was and how it could benefit them and how people would find you. And what I found out is all my franchisees were order takers. They had not worn out the leather on their shoes and had raw knuckles from pounding on doors. And so we had to reinvent ourselves and go a completely different direction. But yeah, timing, a lot of lessons. I remember ultimately we didn't have to file bankruptcy. I was able to negotiate everything so that we could settle and buy myself enough time that the consolidators that were out there in the space were buying up ISP businesses for $1,000 a user. They just were gobbling it all up. And so we determined, we've negotiated on behalf of all our franchisees, we would let them out of their franchise agreement, and we pre-negotiated a deal where their businesses could all be acquired. They would actually make a tidy profit. They were the only ones that made money on the deal. My investors and we lost everything, but these guys saw another day, which was the heaviest weight that I had on my shoulders. I mean, my investors were parts of large organizations. This was a pittance to them, but I looked eye to eye to people that were leaving corporate America, cashing in their retirement fund, taking out, lines of credit against their houses. The future of their families were on the line here, everywhere from Norfolk, Nebraska to Los Angeles to Atlanta, Chicago. I mean, we were all over the country. And so basically me and our core staff, we worked for 90 days without pay because we were running out of runway at that time. And we transitioned all these guys that wanted to sell. And then there were some that were in smaller communities that didn't have a marketplace for the buyers. You know, like your Norfolk and Columbus, Nebraska, Fremont, Kearney, those kinds of cities. But they owned computer stores, and it was still a viable business to them because AT&T and Sprint weren't there yet. And so we had to decentralize something that was very central. And so we spent 3 months where we were central authentication, centralized billing, centralized email hosting, and have to give them a business in the box so that they could operate without us. And so we basically had an amnesty day. Everybody released us of our 10-year obligation under the franchise agreement, and we released them of all their obligation to us. And to this day, I have people that, you know, from 20 some years ago, or even their children, that'll reach out and have identified me somewhere and talk about those stories of those times back then with gratitude. And it's very heartwarming. But the end of the day, when that business closed, right, I had gone from a staff of about 80 all the way down to like 6 of us that spent those last few months. And the last day, my investor from Singapore flies over, and before we're shutting the door, he says, "What's next?" And I go, "Well, I got some thoughts and some ideas." And he goes, "Let's go talk about them." So we go to the same Chinese restaurant. I share it with him, and he says, "I like it. I like it." He goes, "How much?" And I go, "Well, I have a $500,000 plan and a $5 million plan." And he looks over at me and he goes, "Let me hear the $500,000 plan." And I told it to him, and in a handshake and on the back of a napkin, he wired $500,000 to me within 24 hours before we had an agreement, so that I didn't have to close that infrastructure and that core staff that had been through, you know, the band of brothers that had been through the worst together. And I looked over at him and said, "You just lost millions of dollars, not to mention you brought some co-investors in of other businesses, you know, so there's, you know, you guys all lost money together. Why in the world would you take another flyer on me?" And he said, "Chad, because we just paid for your college education and now we want to reap the reward."
Yeah,
and I was, I'm like, okay. He says, I know that you just made 1,000 mistakes and the pain that you just went through, and, you know, some of it was obviously circumstantial, but everything that you've seen has value in it. And before you go on to that next thing that's, you know, I know you're going to have a hit on, we want to be a part of it. And that was a very humbling day. And we did very well in the next round.